It is now my privilege to introduce Dr. Daniel le Roux. He's head of the Cognition and Technology Research Group, Department of Information Science at Stellenbosch University. To you, it's really a privilege having you here, Dan. He is going to speak about the automation of work, a SA perspective. I hope he's not going to say that librarians aren't necessary anymore. They're going to automate us. So we're looking forward to your talk. Please, Dr. le Roux.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks everybody. Just waiting for the slides. Should I click something? Excellent. Yes, what an absolute privilege to be speaking face to face at a conference again. This is the first time in, I think, 2 years. And I haven't taught face to face in the same time. So as with some of the previous speakers, certainly a fair amount of nerves, which I'm sure you'll understand. Thanks for the invitation. I'll be 100% honest, I was a bit skeptical when I got the invitation and a bit nervous. I'll tell you why. I was told to talk perhaps a bit on the topic that I wrote the piece for the Mail and Guardian. It was titled Let's Race With, Not Against the Machine, and it was sort of a follow-on on research I did in 2017, 2018 on the automation of work and sort of sketching a forecast for the South African economy on that basis. And then somewhere a bit lower down in the middle paragraph there, I made this statement. And I remember writing it and thinking, geez, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And when I got the invitation, I thought, this is probably it, right? I'm going to come, and this is a chance for the librarians to get one back at me. So I'm expecting some things to be tossed at me from the floor, and that's perfectly accepted. But of course, I want to counter this, say that I only have and it's true, I haven't physically been in our library in quite a while, not due to COVID, but just because I hardly ever need to go there. But I only have a single shortcut in my browser, and that's the link to our university's library search portal. So I should have probably put that in the Mail and Guardian article as well to justify that a bit. But of course I use the library every day, literally every day. It's just that I'm not physically there. And I think it was Professor Hinchcliffe that said that, of course, the library has been online for quite a long time, so it's nothing strange. Just because I don't physically go there doesn't mean I don't use the services. It doesn't mean it doesn't play a super important role in my own and my students' development. Okay, I'm going to talk about 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is, of course, now a term that you hear pretty much everywhere, and everybody's an expert on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Everybody knows what it's about, etc., etc. I've really don't have much of a clue, but I'm going to try and at least introduce you to some of the ideas that I have around it. And then the notion of automation anxiety, which was referred to now, the idea that are our jobs going to disappear? And if they do disappear, what are we going to do and what are we going to eat? So I'm going to talk about that as some background. And then I'm going to sketch a forecast. I say far-fetched there because there's been quite a bit of criticism of my model. To be fair, it's not really my forecast. It's based on the forecast made by the Oxford Institute for Future Studies by Frey and Osborne in 2013. I just mapped that onto the South African landscape and got the numbers from there. So I'll explain a bit of why we should take a bit of care when we interpret those figures. I'll say one or two things about why and how I think COVID-19 may impact labor demand. I don't have a lot of time for that, but I will briefly refer to that. And then I'll say one or two things about how we think about the road ahead, or how, on a macroeconomic level at least, big thinkers in the world are thinking about the road ahead. You're welcome to interrupt me at any point if anything's unclear and you want some explanation. Okay, so Fourth Industrial Revolution, of course, it's really intellectually perhaps inviting for us to think of it as a sort of a cliff, right? The Fourth Industrial Revolution started when somebody said the term Fourth Industrial Revolution, and it started in 2016 and it ended there. It's the real clear-cut delineation of history, but the reality, of course, is way more complex than that. And this is the first thing about 4IR that I think is important to understand is it is really about the convergence of technologies over a long period of time, and at a certain point, some technologies come together and possibilities emerge that were not previously possible when these technologies weren't all on the table. What are these technologies? I like to go back to sort of circa 1950, 1960. The start of digital computing technologies. This is obviously post-war. A lot of these technologies, of course, had their roots in the Second World War. Code crunching efforts. I'm sure some of you have seen or read about some of those on sort of real, what shall we call them? The very first computer scientists and the sort of work they did back then. And a lot of the work that followed that in the sort of the 70s and 80s was based on the ideas to build the ENIAC and some of the other first computers. And then, of course, through the 80s and 90s, broad adoption of digital technologies in workspaces and personal spaces. And then ARPANET and the internet that followed on that. Much later, you are mostly librarians, so you understand the importance of network effects and how networks work. And the interconnectedness of computer networks following on that. And then obviously Tim Berners-Lee and the development of the web-based or internet-based web platforms on which we could now share information. And then came mobile devices and mobile connectivity and Wi-Fi, super important because it means we can now use information on the internet wherever we are. We're no longer limited to physical space. And the cloud, building upon that again, the idea that our data is no longer physically located where we are, but somewhere else, and that changes the ball game again. And what has emerged now, what we often refer to as POPC, is permanently online, permanently connected living. It's a way of living characterized by frequent and ongoing use of internet-based devices throughout our lives. Okay, and we can talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this. I think Professor Lange this morning mentioned distraction. Distraction is a theme that I do a lot of work on, and distraction as a result of permanently online living is a very important theme going forward to my mind. So it's some interesting things there. And then at the sharp end of all of this, where we are now, we're seeing an rapid increase in the development of robotics, machine learning, sensing machines, machine vision, artificial intelligence. All these terms that we see in newspapers with exclamation marks. And of course, these things are happening. It's happening on Stellenbosch campus. There's a lot of development in these areas. And it is potentially creating a whole new way of doing work. Okay. I want to just mention as a very last point here, underlying these sort of flashy developments, there are also a range of less flashy but equally important developments, and a lot of them center around the sort of platforms that businesses and universities and government institutions are using to drive or sort of as a transactional background. Okay, so things like enterprise resource planning systems, etc. These things are super important in terms of automation, and I'll explain why a bit later on. Anyway, you put these technologies together and you reach a certain point of convergence where suddenly it is possible for us to have objects that are connected to the internet, that can see cars around them, that can drive themselves, that can keep a schedule, that can track themselves. Suddenly the possibilities are such that domains of work that were previously only within the sort of domain of human workers, suddenly machines move into that domain, and suddenly it is possible for machines to start working on that. This is Otto, self-driving truck, which is being experimented with in the US. There are roughly, or just under 500,000 truck drivers employed in the US, and you can imagine the sort of anxiety developments such as this creates for truck drivers in the US. This sort of anxiety is, of course, not new. There was some mention of the Luddites earlier this morning. I can't remember who made a quick one, but the Luddites is quite often an example that we think of. The Luddites was obviously a group of sort of militant workers in the first industrial revolution in Britain, that when machines were introduced, particularly in the area of textiles, that made their work redundant or their skills redundant, they went about and destroyed these machines as best they could. And they had various clashes with the British Army, etc., etc. And a lot of us look back on the Luddites today in a sort of a way, say, well, okay, so obviously now looking back, the Luddites were not really right, because on the back of industrial revolutions, not only the first, but also other industrial revolutions thereafter, the second and the third, humans were better off. Increased standard of living, products got cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. So we all know the story of how industrialization changed the quality of human life. So much of what we experience around us in this room today is the product of these first revolutions. So we look back at the Luddites, of course, and, you know, they weren't the smartest group of people. But of course, it is true that as a result of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people did lose their work. And a lot of people got really poor. And a lot of families, because a lot of the sort of work the workers did back then was a sort of a family thing. If your father was a glassmaker, you would become a glassmaker, or whatever the case may be. So a lot of families went from having a sort of a high socioeconomic status into a great deal of poverty. So they were losers. With every industrial revolution, there are going to be losers. Then the big question now is, are the librarians going to be losers in the next industrial revolution? Okay, some good examples historically, and this obviously, the Luddites weren't the first group of people to oppose industrial revolutions. This occurred prior to the Luddites as well. We have got records going back as far as 9th, 10th century of certain kings limiting technological development. And here I'm not referring to digital technologies, of course, but farming technologies, all sorts of technologies in a way to protect a certain group of workers. This is a very old thing. It's not a new thing. But Rifkin provides some really striking examples over the last century in agriculture. So in 1850, and this is US statistics, one farmer could feed 4 people. So a century later, a farmer could feed 78 people. Okay, in 1944, the first mechanical picker was introduced in the South, and it could pick at the same rate as 50 seasoned human pickers. Prior to that, human pickers were used solely, and by 1972, human pickers were no longer utilized at all. 60% of the US workforce worked in farming in the 1850. In 1995, it was less than 3%. Okay, so this idea, and we often use the term creative destruction to refer to it, the idea that we, through our capitalist development, continuously destroy the old way of doing things, and in that process, invent new ways of doing things. And in every cycle of creative destruction, there are winners and there are losers. One way to understand who the winners are is to think of technological progress as being skill biased. And what we basically mean by that is that a new wave of technological advancement tends to favor particular skill sets. Okay. So when we introduced electric street lamps, so actually lamp-lighters is a great example of a job. Lamp-lighters as a profession is something that existed for almost 6 centuries. Right, so the first lamplighters were appointed around, I think, the 11th century AD, and the last ones still worked and lit lamps sort of in the early 1900s. So it's a really long period of time that you had a profession of being a lamplighter, going down the streets and lighting lamps. And obviously, with the introduction of electricity, you don't really need those workers anymore. So the demand for lamplighters decreases, but the demand for electricians increase. Okay, so there's a bias towards a certain set of skills. Okay, so as we have an increasingly complicated technological infrastructure in our economies, we require an increasingly educated workforce, creating some pressure on higher education capacity. So this is also something that's been hinted at before. We have to understand the technologies that underlie us, the systems appreciation. We can't just use these technologies, they don't really understand what is under the bonnet of this car that we're driving. Okay, and this places a lot of pressure on higher education, and in the South African sector we see that say kids, but really adolescents coming into the higher education sector understand how critical it is to have a high degree of education in order to attain a sort of a socioeconomic status that they want to attain. They understand how important a portal higher education is to get there. Okay, now if we think of creative destruction, as long as there's parity between the rate at which we destruct and the rate at which we construct, so the rate at which we destroy jobs and the rate at which we create jobs, then of course going forward, we shouldn't have a problem. labor demand should stay more or less the same, and we should have an economy that employs or has work for everybody. However, if we destroy faster than we create, then at some point we reach a point where, you know, we hear the figure 35% unemployment rate in South Africa and how bad that is, etc., but we don't confront the possibility that perhaps we only need 65, 70% of working age population to work in order to drive the economy. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying it is possible that if we develop along this line, one of the ways in which it's going to play out is that full economic employment, full employment of the working age population is no longer required. Okay, and this creates all sorts of futuristic ideas that man can be liberated from labor, and suddenly we have a sort of a freedom. If you're interested in that, I suggest you consider Rifkin's work, which is quite interesting. The reason, probably the primary reason why the fourth industrial revolution, however, is considered in sort of a different light to the first, second, and third industrial revolutions has not got that much to do with the destruction, complete destruction of work, as it has to do with inequality. Okay, this graph here shows a couple of important lines. It's based on US data again. So that the top one is essentially GDP per capita. It's labor productivity, the gray one. And you can see that the gray one from the 1950s to 2010 continued a sort of a real increase, right? A sharp increase. We see a slight drop in GDP per capita, the orange line, around 2007-8, and that was, of course, the economic crisis in the US, but we can see it recovering quite clearly there. However, this area around the sort of the 70s, 80s, I want you to have a look at where the blue line decouples from the gray and orange lines. Okay, this is referred to as the Great Decoupling by McAfee and Brynjolfsson, and basically what that means is prior to the 1970s, 1980s, as economies became more productive, median household income also rose. Right? So as an economy, we're becoming more and more productive, maybe to some extent as a result of our adoption of technology, but we're creating more, developing more, producing more, and our families generally get the benefit of this, right? Median family income rise. So as we as an economy is creating more, everybody's benefiting from our increased productivity. However, and now remember the timeline we spoke about when we spoke about those technologies, digital computing around the 1970s, 80s, broad adoption of that in organizational spaces from 80, and then of course more automation around the 90s, 2000s. You can see how that decoupling matches the timeline of technological development. Okay, and this indicator is really the one that you should be concerned about when you're looking at 4-hour, or that's the one that those experts which I believe are at the forefront of studying these developments spend their time talking about. So it's an increase in inequality. We're still creating as much as we created earlier, but median family income doesn't rise together with that. Okay, what's happening here? So this is the Gini coefficient in the States, and you can see there the timeline again, 1990 to 2017, that steady increase in Gini. So this sort of pattern we've seen not only in the US, but we've also seen it in previously more egalitarian countries. So countries that generally had high levels of economic equality, moving towards the sort of inequality that we as South Africans are pretty much familiar with. Question is, if you start off with a high level of inequality as we do, where are we going to end up if we adopt the same sort of technologies? Okay. Now, the linkage between 4IR and inequality is difficult to make. There's a lot of arguments made for that linkage, saying that there is a causal relationship there, but there are also arguments countering that. So this is a debate. I'm certainly not stating that it's definitely like that, but the evidence is quite compelling. Okay. To understand why this happens, a quick little causal loop diagram. Adoption of technology increases the educational level of the workforce. So if I have a small little company and I'm adopting increasingly smart technology, I want increasingly smart people to work for me that can work with this technology, right? It also increases the productivity of my employees. So I've got smarter people that are more productive. So I might do the work of 100 people with 20 people now, and this is happening across the country in all sorts of startups, taking on big organizations. We see a lot of this in the insurance industry now, or in the financial industry, in fintech. Big banks, big insurance companies, smaller startups are using technology smartly, and with 20 or 30 computer scientists and data scientists and engineers, they're doing what OutSurance or Sanlam does with 2,000 people. Okay. So this brings down the size of my workforce that I require. This obviously increases the income per employee. That increases the income per employee, and because I have fewer workers, I also can increase the income of my employee, because I can pay to 20 people much more than I have to pay 1,000 people if my productivity and my market scope is sort of the same. That's really the idea underlying why technological advancement would drive inequality. Fewer people earning more money on the basis of increased education and smart adoption of technology. Okay, let's have a quick look just before we look at the forecast for South Africa, a couple of basic indicators of our economic landscape. Sorry, the color, I'm not sure how well you can see, but on the right here you can see the key. It was just 2008 to 2019. This is based on Stats SA data. This morning, Kanchu spoke a bit about data and data quality, of course, in this space. Data is always a challenge. So what the color in the bars indicate is essentially how many people work, do not work, are students, don't want to work, are job seekers, are people who want to work but they stopped seeking work, and you can see those numbers change over time. Most of you are probably fairly familiar with this structure. We read a lot about these numbers in the press. And here I've used the same data set, but I've combined this with educational attainment. Okay, so as librarians, I presume most of you are pretty familiar with the NQF levels. And this basically just shows how the South African working age population is composed based on NQF level structures. So look at the blue bars at the top. So that they represent university graduates, NQF level 7, 8, and 9, and 10. And it's not a massive increase, but at least if you look sharply, you should see that the blue does seem to increase a bit, right? Maybe we just want to see it, but to me it does look like it's increasing a tad. But obviously, still a very large portion of our workers, it's just school qualifications. That's cool. Okay. Lastly, the income data in the QLFS data sets which I use are not super accurate, so don't worry too much about the fluctuations you see year on year. That's an artifact of the data more than it is an actual finding. But what you should see here is the height of the bar represents median income for the NQF level group. So as one would expect, higher qualification is associated with higher income. And you can see how that drops off towards lower education. Okay, so remember when I said that adolescents leaving school understand that if you want to climb the median income ladder, if you want to move into a higher socioeconomic status, which of course all of them want to do, the key path towards that is through higher education. The data shows that quite clearly. They understand that intuitively, and obviously that's going to create pressure on our higher education system. Okay, Fran Osborne, 2013 at Oxford, they create what was called the automation index, and basically what they did was they used a pretty novel technique to assign a probability of automation to an occupation. That basically means, in their terms, the chances that the work being done in this occupation can be automated in the next decade. Okay, it's an in-principle thing, it's a theoretical possibility, and I've just, for interest's sake, cut out some of these probabilities for you. So accountants and auditors, you can see there, 0.94. So there's a 94% chance that in the next 10 years, the work done by an auditor or accountant will be automatable, in principle. And I just included the library-related occupations that was included. It's just the 3 there. I'm not sure how librarians and library assistants and library technicians differ in terms of the type of work they do, but this is based on their index. On what basis are these forecasts made? They are forecasts. they're based on the idea that there are certain bottlenecks to automation technology. I don't really have time to go into this too much depth. Are they relevant to the South African economy? They are, but you have to remember that there's what we call the social shaping of technology, right? You guys know that if you go to the US or to Europe, it's rare to find a human cash register at the supermarket. Okay? It's all automated. So in principle, it's already possible to automate the work of cash registers in South Africa at ShopRite, but ShopRite does not choose to do that. And there's government pressure, there's unions, there are security concerns. So there's all sorts of factors specific to South Africa that will change whether a job actually gets automated or not. Okay, so the index indicates, in principle, automatability, not necessarily will it be automated in South Africa. Keep that in mind. And there's limitations to the data, so just interpret with caution. So this was the general forecast that we came up with. And what it basically says is that 24% of our workers fall in this level 10 category, 15% level 9, and this is obviously higher risk of automation, so a 90 to 100% chance of automatability is a quarter of our workforce, and that's the way it panned out. Yeah, and obviously, when I published this data, it was radio interviews and TV, and people were in a massive panic about this, you know, all gonna lose our jobs in the next 10 years. But of course, the nuance, which I now explained to you, which was well written up in the paper, was ignored, as it is by journalists. I just want to quickly show a couple more graphs. Plot NQF level on this, okay? What you should see is level 0 and level 1 jobs that are unlikely to get automated are typically performed by people that have high levels of education. It's not always the case. Auditors and accountants typically have tertiary qualifications, but they are in the level 9 and 10. But generally the trend is that higher education leads to a degree of resistance of automation because you're doing the sort of work that's difficult to automate. Okay, it's not always the rule, but it is generally the trend. And then this is an important one. This is income in relation to automation probability. So look at the dark blue line. So those are people where work is difficult to automate, and you can see how the dark blue line climbs systematically from 2007 to 2019 relative to the red lines, which seem to they're also climbing, but a much sort of less steep incline. So it means that people that do work that is less automatable are reaping the benefits of that. So this partly illustrates that inequality effect that we spoke about, that certain types of work are just not valued as much as other types of work. And this is partially probably due to a degree of automation replacement of workers in the red categories. Okay, I see my time is up, but I want to say just two things about the potential impact of COVID-19, which is a big question. I think, first of all, the need for organizations throughout the economy to manage a distributed workforce implies that they're probably going to adopt some form of cloud-based integrative platforms, more and more. Now, this process would have happened in any way, but what COVID-19 did is it probably sped up certain adoption processes in organizations. So my prediction is that we will see a reduction in demand for mid-level clerical administrative information processing type work, because a lot of this can already be automated by the smart use of digitalized platforms. Okay, so that's my prediction. And then lastly, what's the path forward? There are various ways to navigate this, and this is a very interesting economic topic. One thing is certain, that we want to ensure social security. We want to ensure that independent of whatever situation you are in as a worker, you still have food to eat and you have sort of the basic security, social security things are in place. So I think a lot of countries are looking at that first. To get there, a number of proposals are on the table. One is negative taxation of manual labor. The other is large-scale retraining of workers to areas in which that resist automation. Another is UBI, or Universal Basic Income. Some experiments on UBI is already running in South Africa, in the Northern Cape. There's a couple up and running, which is very interesting to keep an eye on. But these are all options on the table. I've had some engagements with national government on this, which has been really interesting, and how they're thinking about that. And I'll tell you what, I am really glad I sit at Stellenbosch University and not in the union buildings trying to handle this maze, because in theoretical grounds it's easy and it's actually a bit of fun, but in a practical level these are super complex problems, really difficult to deal with. Yeah, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate that, and hopefully I can answer some questions later on.